fog lay over Blackwater Bay like unspooled lambswool, clinging to hull and rope and the shoulders of men who whispered because the fog made whisperers of them all. The sea lapped with a patient tongue at the rough stones of the wharfs and the barnacled posts. Rope creaked. Spars knocked with a dull, hollow clatter that disappeared into the muffled hush and did not return. Robb Stark stood at the prow of a white harbor galley and watched the city grow out of the white tower by thorny tower, the broken-toothed silhouette of the city walls. The red keep's sharp angles lurking atop Aegon's high hill, the listing crowstep roofs of Flea Bottom and the crooked chimneys that breathed pale smoke into heavier cloud. Gray Wind pressed his long snout into the wind and seemed to taste the city. Robb's hand settled in the wolf's ruff and felt the animal's breath, steady and hot. "They've not sighted us," Brynden Tully murmured at his shoulder. "Or if they have, they're pretending not to. I've seen leaky casks with more vigilance than King's Landing, when it fancies itself safe." "They've chained the river and think that enough," Catelyn said. She wore a plain gray cloak, the hood drawn low. Her hands were bare and tight around each other, as if she had folded a prayer between them. "Chains can be raised and dropped. They believe themselves clever." "They believe many things," Theon Greyjoy said, slouching against the rail with the insolent ease of a man who had never once been cowed by fog. "Salt eats iron sooner or later. So does hunger." Robb did not answer. He was counting time under his breath, pacing the beat of oars he could not see. On the dark water around them, the white harbor cogs and galleys rode at anchor, their sails furled, their crews kneeling to muffle metal and drag canvas slow. Wyman Manderley had sent what ships he could spare south on the quiet word of ravens that did not go astray. Jason Mallister's leaner vessels had slipped out of Seaguard in the night. A half-score riverboats taken at Fairmarket had crept by way of the estuaries and sheltered coves. When they raised their banners, it would not be on the water. "Listen," said Brynden, his head cocked. They all heard it then. The distant roll of carts on cobble, the thin cry of gulls, the bark of dogs. But beneath that, beneath the watery rhythm and the muttered work-song of distant stevedores, something else. Something like a hand rapping twice against a door in a pattern only a few knew how to recognize. 2 beats, a pause, a beat. 2 beats. A longer pause, a beat. The signal through the fog. Catelyn breathed out slowly as if the fog would take her breath and hide it away. "He keeps his word," she said, not naming the spider for fear the name itself had legs. "For tonight." Robb nodded. He looked once to the east, where the moon had been softened to a smudge, and then he raised his hand. Somewhere unseen, a small bell chimed once, tinny and pure. That was Theon's work. He had placed the bell himself in the wicker cradle they'd lashed to the buoy. In the fog it sounded like it had rung from under the sea. "Time," Robb said. "Go." They went. On shore, the fog curled through lanes and alleyways and softened the piss-stained grime of the muddy way. Men moved through it like oiled shadows, faces smeared and helms hooded in scraps of sacking, swords wrapped in lambswool to dull any kiss of iron. At their head the great John Umber grinned, white teeth shining momentarily in a gap of fog, and then he dragged the grin away with a thick finger as if he had stolen it from his own face to keep in his pocket, till later. Beside him Tyto's Blackwood moved like a taller shadow, eyes deep-set and thoughtful in the dim, and behind them came a file of men in the drab of commoners, their cloaks dyed with onion juice and soot. "Smell that?" the great John rumbled low. "Fish," said Blackwood, "and old water, and the fear of men who have too much to lose." "You speak overmuch in Proverbs, Blackwood. Proverbs last longer than kings." The great John snorted. "We'll see." They crossed under the chalk-white scrawl of a broken signboard and came to the gatehouse. The mud gate was a hunched, sullen thing, squatting between squat towers and thinking its muddy thoughts. Torches bled color from the fog. The gold cloaks upon the walls coughed. A boy thumped his hands against his arms to keep his blood moving. Beneath, the postern door waited, a thing that had never thought in its life. It opened without a sound. No one said Varys. No one said thanks. One man, long and narrow as a piece of wire, tilted his head, saw what he had promised to see, and vanished back into the fog. Men poured through the postern like a slow-spilling ale. The flow kept even and low by the great John bursting into an occasional grin that he snatched back again immediately. Above, a gull cried out like a child. "Quiet!" said Blackwood to men who were already quiet. In the gatehouse, Jacelyn Bywater, commander of the city watch, had his jaw fastened tight as a nail driven all the way to the head. He had not been bribed, and he had not been threatened in a way he recognized. He had only been made to look down from the walls and see fog and watch his men droop like old wheat. He had been trying all night to hold something against the mist by sheer force of posture. He turned when he heard the sound of wood and leather move like a man thinks in his sleep, but his sword was not in his hand quick enough. The old men tell in taverns that war is a matter of banners and numbers. Bywater knew better and had known better, and still his sword was not in his hand in time. The first umber through the door hit him with a shield before he could make his mouth say "sound the," and then the world went red around the rim like a cold iron struck and heated all at once. The horn sounded anyway, but it was late and not the horn Bywater had intended. It was a northern sound, low and long, and it made the night seem to lean toward itself. The fog lifted abruptly, or seemed to, as if prodded by that horn. Men sprang from behind stacks of barrels, from under carts, from the shadow of ladders and the crooks of stairways. A rope fell with a quiet whumph. The gate caps groaned. The chains came alive. "Now," said Brynden on the galley, and the oars took the water, and Grey Wind's ears pricked forward like a promise. The mud gate rose a handspan, two, a man's breadth, the murky river trying at once to pour out and in. The first of the riverboats slid into the gap like a fish slipping under a reed, light, knife-narrow, its rowers bent like question marks. Men leaped from their bows to the wet stone, boots smacking, and knives flashed. The gatehouse's armory door rattled and then gave. Oil flared and was stamped out. The blue banners of House Umber and the black and red of Blackwood's ravens and the grey direwolf of Stark unfurled in the warm breath of the gatehouse as if they had been there always. Robb came up the river with the second wave, Grey Wind at the prow, the wolf's great forepaws on the gunwale. The wolf threw his head back and howled, and the sound went thin and long through the city. Men flinched even if they had never heard a wolf before. The young king in the north cut the rope that fastened the ladder to the boat with one clean stroke, and when he climbed he looked for a heartbeat like a boy clambering into a tree he had been forbidden to climb. Then he was on the stones, and the sword in his hand was not a stick, and he was not a boy. "Spare the small folk," Robb said to those who could hear him. "Spare them all." He did not say it twice, not because he did not mean it deeply, but because the night had come to a place where words slew off men like water, and only what was in their bones went with them. What was in the bones of Northmen was a cold honor and a colder rage. They went forward with both. Flea Bottom was awake and not awake. Doors slammed, shutters banged, dogs barked, and a woman with a rag tied around her hair spat out 3 curses in a language that had never been written down. In the street of Flower the fog smelled of bread not quite baked and fear nearly baked through. In the street of Sisters a lamp fell and split, and a wall of leaning would leapt to show its guts. "Water!" Someone sobbed in a voice as hoarse and tender as a mother's who has wept all day. The gold cloaks assembled and then unassembled as a boy pulls apart and recombines the same 6 sticks in a dozen different shapes. The one clear thing in the city's noise was the howl of the wolf and the horn's long breath. The bells did not ring, not at first. In the great September of Baelor, the septons muttered and fumbled with the London bell ropes as if they had never seen them before. The city had rung every bell it owned into madness at the prince's wedding. After, the ropes had been tied up above the reach of trembling hands. The bells remembered being dragged to their throats and forced to sing until their bronze lips bruised. When finally they spoke, they did so with the grudging confusion of a choir awakened by a boot. Robb did not hear them. He had the old gate before him now, and beyond it the slope that led up to Aegon's high hill where the Red Keep squatted in the fog like a spider in its web. He breathed in the stink of tar and blood and pushed black curls off his brow with the back of his hand. Grey Wind pressed against his thigh, steadying him with a weight that felt like an oath. The boy who had lived in Winterfell and climbed in its bones and learned how to pull a trout from the heart of a river with his bare hands was somewhere within him. Tonight he behaved himself and let the king use his eyes. They took the old gate in blood and splinters and luck, and they took it because the men behind Robb believed that if they failed their fathers would turn in their cairns. Sometimes that is enough. Above, within the Red Keep, Cersei Lannister watched fog stroke the crenellations and wanted to slap the night as one slaps a child that will not stop crying. She had drunk only a little. She was saving the rest. Her gown was silk the color of old wine, and her hair had been braided by a girl whose hands had not stopped shaking since she had first touched the queen's scalp. The girl had not been beaten because Cersei had not the time. She recognized the shame of that as one recognizes that one has gone to bed with a headache and woken with it. "What is that sound?" Joffrey demanded, a thin quaver of hysteria under the jewels of his crown. He did not send for the hound because he had not dismissed the hound. The hound had gone wherever the hound went when thick fog and the smell of oil touched the back of his throat and reminded him of a fire that had never gone out. "Wolves," Cersei said. "Dogs. Rats. The moans of whores and the prayers of fools. It's a city." She pressed a hand to her temple. "Go to Maegor's holdfast." "I will not run." "You do nothing else," said Tyrion from the shadow of the anteroom, his voice as dry as a chip of old wood. He needed a shave, and he could not feel his left cheek where a horse's knee had brushed it at speed the previous day. "It's merely a matter of whether you run forward or backward, and which story you tell yourself about it afterward. You—" Joffrey's color was high and ugly. "Uncle." "Yes, your grace." Tyrion inclined his head, which hurt, so he stopped. "Do you hear bells? I told them to ring the bells for danger. I must find Bywater." He had men stationed at the King's Gate and the Iron Gate and the Dragon Gate, and he trusted fewer of them than he trusted perturbations in the weather. The spider had been quiet. Quiet spiders are not safe spiders. He rubbed his eyes, and when he removed his knuckle it was rimmed with a black smear that could have been smoke. Cersei had been awake since the city's baker's third bell, the one that sounded like a tired man asking someone to please wake up. She had sent Tommen to Maegor's with 4 of the kettle blacks and enough gold to make a guildmaster blush. She had told a different version of the truth to half the court, which was all the court that remained. She had had a brief, clear thought of wildfire and had walked out onto a balcony to look at the black river and the wet sheen of the fog and had imagined for the length of one long breath the city alight from the hook to the gate of the gods. She had come back inside. She had sent for Haelene and then not seen him. She had stared at a tapestry of Aegon the Conqueror for a while and thought how small the dragon looked with green thread for fire. "Ser Mandon," she said, "take the king to the holdfast. If anyone attempts to bar your way—" "They will not," Tyrion said. "There's no one left with that much sense. If any ghost in that city held real power, it was not Aegon's but Tywin's. Tywin at table with maps. Tywin whose presence had a temperature. He had left his daughter in the city with a half-domesticated beast and a clutch of snakes, and he had taken the dragon out of the Red Keep with him when he went. For the first time in her life Cersei thought she understood why men hung banners. So that when they fell and the wind took them it was not only canvas torn and carried away, but also the idea that had been stitched into them, the cloth that had no cloth. She pressed thumb to middle finger and felt the flint-sketched grating of skin and bone and told herself she was lighting a spark she might yet need. "Maegor's," she said again to Joffrey. "You can piss from its highest tower onto the heads of wolves. If that pleases you, go." Tyrion went another way, with a handful of men whose names he could not presently remember and a lantern that guttered and seemed to resent him. He could not find Jacelyn Bywater. The King's Gate seemed to be holding as a drunkard holds a complicated argument, on momentum and luck and sheer brute refusal to think. From the parapet he saw shadows move and the glint of a wolf's eye and the hard bright shine of well-kept steel, and he thought, so young. They were all young. A world of old liars sending boys to hold walls. He thought of wildfire and counted the cost. The one sin he had never balked at was arithmetic. He found that he had the shape of a plan and that it was smaller than the hole in his pocket a mouse had made the year he had first slept alone. He did not, in the end, burn the river. The river would burn another night and sing a different song. He used men. He used fear, and the timing of drums, and the rumor he set loose with 2 silver stags pressed into hands that did not know the worth of their own lives. And still the wolves came through. The gates fell in a pattern any student of history would recognize written later in neat ink. Mudgate, Old Gate, Dragon Gate. The names did not matter to the fog. The fog wore 1,000 names and smiled with none of them. By midday the wolf banner snapped from towers that had not forgotten dragons. By afternoon it hung in the shadow of the Red Keep with a kind of quiet that was not peace. The city did not storm the Red Keep at once. Robb had not come to drench the steps in blood if another way could be found. He ringed the hill and drew his noose tight, and he sent a rider with a white flag that looked like a torn shirt to the gate. The rider had Grey Wind's hairs in the cuff of his sleeve, and the calm of a man who had crossed from youth to something else since sunrise. It was Varys who came down to meet him, though he came in the livery of a functionary, and the rider pretended he did not know him. "The Queen will speak," the eunuch said, "to the king in the north, in the great hall, under the Iron Throne." The way he said the last words was like a man telling a child they may play in a field until the sun goes down, so long as they do not step on the grey stones at its center. Robb stood surrounded by his captains and by Catelyn, whose hands had stopped squeezing each other and hung now composed at her sides. He listened. He looked to Brynden. He remembered Winterfell, and his father's voice speaking law, and the iron smell of cold water in morning air, and his father's hand on his shoulder. The day had no sun in it. All the light was a pale wash like milk. "Under my colors," he said, "and with my men behind me." "Of course," Varys said, as if he had expected to be disappointed and was pleased not to be. They went up Aegon's high hill in a file of gray and black and brown. The great hall had been built for an empire that believed itself eternal, and yet it never failed to feel cramped when it was full of frightened courtiers. Today there were not many courtiers. Too many had fled, or were locked in maegres with shut mouths and clutched bedclothes, but what they lacked in number they made up in the density of their fear. The Iron Throne twisted in the fog-damp air like a thing that had grown in darkness and wanted to keep growing. The smell in the hall was oil and stale rosemary and panic. Cersei sat in a chair that was not a throne. Joffrey stood behind her at an angle he thought made him seem taller. The Hound was not there. Tyrion leaned against a pillar and let only one corner of his mouth move when he saw them. It could have been a smile and might not have been. Sansa was there in the pale gown the Queen favored for her on serious days. She was thinner than when Robb had last seen her. Her wrists were like the ends of willow twigs that had not learned how to sprout leaves. When she saw him she made a sound. Once, under her breath, and her hand flew to her throat as if she had been struck. She did not move. She had learned the value of stillness as others learn sums. That she managed not to look at Grey Wind was the act of a saint or a student of terror. Cersei's smile had 1,000 small muscles in it working as hard as they could. "Robb Stark," she said. She did not say king in the north. She did not say boy. The fog had not entered the Red Keep, but something like fog had made its way into her voice. "You have my leave to kneel." "Leave," Robb said simply, "is one thing I have not come to ask of you." He could feel Catelyn stiffen beside him, a reminder without words. He spoke slower. "My sister." "Sister," Joffrey repeated. "Too high." "Lady Sansa is my guest," Cersei said, all sweetness. "She has just told me a beautiful thing about the old gods. How they look out from trees, with eyes like knots in old wood. She is very pious, my lady, my son. She is very pious and very brave." Sansa's eyes did not move. The room had become a pond in winter with a skin of clear ice and something dark moving underneath. "Lady Sansa comes with me," Robb said, and then, before Cersei's mouth could become a blade, he added, "in exchange for your son and your person kept safe under guard." "For now." "For now," Cersei echoed. "And for what do you hold us safe, child?" "The world is crawling with men who mistake the sight of a wolf for the feeling of safety. Safety is a story you tell a younger brother so he will close his eyes." Robb wanted to glance at his mother, but he did not. "For peace," he said. He was surprised at the taste of the word. It was not like milk or iron, but something he had had once as a boy and had forgotten. "I hold you for peace," and for justice. I ask for recognition of the North's and the Riverland's freedom. I ask for mine and mine to go home. And you expect the city to grant you its crown's authority, to abolish itself with a nod in a fog," Tyrion said pleasantly, as if they spoke of some clever trick with dice. "I did not say the city," Robb said. "You have claimed kings." He glanced at Joffrey, who flushed. "I will give one king to another." "Another," Cersei repeated, soft, tasting the word. She raised a hand and watched her own fingers move. "Which other? My brother carries the Lannister war in his bones, but he does not sit a throne." "Stannis?" Catelyn said, and her voice made men in the hall say to themselves, "Oh, and be quiet. The law says Stannis." Cersei laughed, and it was not a sound any person would have named a laugh if they had not been told it was one. "Law. I remember law. It sits on the tongue like a bit of metal you want to spit out, and you think to bargain with the law. Child. The law will not bargain with you. It will put your head on a block and thank you for your reason." "He is the king," Brynden said. He might have been speaking of tides. "Let Stannis come," Joffrey said, and then swallowed, because he had heard what his voice had done. "Let him. I'll feed him too." He faltered then, because he did not know the ends of his own sentences. "We have bread," Robb said, not looking at the boy. "This city does not. We will feed them. We will not rape your people or sack your churches. We will not string men up for sport or cut the tongues from boys for singing the wrong songs. My terms are clear. Sansa with me, you and yours safe in my keeping. A raven flies to Lord Stannis Baratheon from my hand. He will come and I will parley with him, and we will find a way to end this without burning the river." "You speak like a septon." "No," Robb said. "I speak like a man who can count." There was a small silence then, tight as a drum's skin. The eyes of the hall kept going to the wolf as if the animal's breath made the air move. The sound of gray winds, slow inhale and slower exhale, shaped the moment. At last Cersei leaned back in her chair and let the moment fall away. "Take her," she said, and Sansa's head jerked, as if she had not and would never in her life expect the word to be spoken to set her free. "Take her, then, wolf, and take your fog with you, and send your raven. Send your honest letter. I shall wait for the law to come and eat my heart." "Mother," Joffrey said, shocked. "You cannot." "Go to Maegor's," Cersei said very gently. "Go to Maegor's and look at your brother. See how he eats when someone offers him bread. Learn something, if you can." Later, Sansa would remember very little of leaving the hall. She would remember the wolf's smell, faintly of wet stone and iron, and the way her feet seemed to have forgotten how many steps it took to cross the space between one life and another. She would remember a black-haired man watching her from the shadow of a pillar with an expression that a kinder world would have given to an uncle who liked to buy you sweets. She would remember that she did not, in the end, look back. "Stay near me," Robb told her on the steps. His voice shook once and then steadied. He had forgotten how tall she had grown. "I will," she said. She did not trust her voice longer than 2 words. Catelyn was careful with her hands. She did not reach, because she knew that if she touched her daughter they would both shatter. She walked on the other side and listened to Sansa breathe. It was like listening to a song you'd thought you'd never hear again, and it made her teeth ache. The city did not cheer them. The city watched, and the eyes of the city were tired and glittering. A woman called Sansa's name once softly, and then put her hand over her own mouth as if the name might betray her to the air. Men on ladders fixed wolf banners to towers with the efficiency of carpenters. "Bread," Robb said, to no one, and Brynden nodded. The loaves came dusted in flour and solemn, and they were handed out from the stairs of the Great September and the foot of the King's Gate and at the head of the Street of Steel, and some men cried when they put the bread between their teeth because their mouths had forgotten what it was for. The gold cloaks stacked their spears and leaned against walls and stared at their own hands. Jacelyn Bywater sat on a stool with his head wrapped and said nothing at all for a long time. Later he would speak a few sharp sentences and resign of his own will, which is to say he would step away from the thing that could not recognize him anymore. That night, Robb scratched a letter on thick paper with ink that wanted to sprawl. He wrote Stannis Baratheon, Lord of Dragonstone, by his own hand King of Westeros. He wrote as the king in the north, and he wrote simply, because he did not have the taste for the embroidery of petty courtesies, and because he thought Stannis would throw away any letter that smelled of roses. He wrote, I hold the city. I have in my keeping the queen and her son. I have freed my sister. I will hold the city until you come and propose terms. I will cede you the city and the throne if you recognize the independence of the north and the riverlands, and take from me those prisoners whose crimes you will judge. I will leave you your war with the Lannisters or take it with me home. I will not stay. Winter is coming and I will not stay. He sanded the ink and folded the letter and sealed it with gray wax. His seal impression did not come out clean the first time. He did it again and again until the dire wolf shone clear. The raven went up at dawn through the last rags of fog, flapped its greasy wings once as if to shrug off the city's smell, and chose the wind with the talent of a creature that does not compliment itself when it is right. Stannis came in 4 days. He did not arrive like a storm, because storms announce themselves too soon and too loudly. He did not arrive like a thief, because thieves hate the open ground. He came like death, quiet, cold, and real. His ships showed first, hard shapes riding the morning, their sails full of wind that had been elsewhere for a week. Then his standards on the shore, the crowned stag on black and gold, the red heart in flame that teased the eye like a rash. He camped on the south bank of the river, just out of easy bowshot. Davos Seaworth went among the tents with the habitual ease of a man who could move untouched through any market because he had never carried himself like a lord. He took a quiet inventory of who had come: fair Lyseni, hollow-eyed pirates with expensive shirts, Castle's men of the Stormlands with the sea in their beards, a red woman whose presence made candles look paler. For days, Davos said to himself and to the god he had sometimes spoken to when he needed a simple god and not a complicated one. For days, and they took it. A comet blazes and men go where they think it points, said Melisandre, who had appeared beside him like a flame, suddenly remembering it had been banks of coal all along. But the comet is gone now, old onion. It has returned to the sky to watch and judge. I thought we agreed you would not call me that, Davos said, kind without softness. You are what you were, the red woman said, and are. Davos looked across the water. The city's walls had grown new teeth. The wolf banner snapped true. They're not looting. They mean to bargain with the Lord's chosen. Men bargain with men. Chosen don't always listen. Stannis will, the woman said, and the flame at her throat trembled as if in assent. Stannis did. He stood on the riverbank with his hands behind his back as if he were looking for a dropped coin, and watched the city until the light altered. The air was heavy with river moss and the faint world-curled scent of the drag of chain under water. Davos watched his king measure the walls, the gatehouses, the towers' intervals, and then watched him turn slightly and take in the north bank and the ground beyond the city. It was as if the man could see layers of roads beneath the roads, as if he had spent his life walking to a gallows and had learned every step. Send word, Stannis said. Parley. They met on the river's edge, on a spit of wet sand where no man's archers would be bold enough to claim advantage. Each delegation brought 10 men and no banners, as had been agreed. Robb wore plain mail and a rough-spun cloak of gray that did not hide the kingliness of his bearing half as well as he thought. Catelyn came with him and Brynden Blackfish as well. Great John Umber was there because he had threatened to walk into the river and swim to the other side if they did not let him. Stannis wore a breastplate with the device he had taken, stag in a heart of fire, and the thing looked like it had been hammered directly from a thought into metal. They bowed to each other a fraction, and neither knelt. I have your letter, Stannis said. His voice had no decoration to it. If he had ever learned to sing, no one had bothered to write the song down. You have my city. It is not mine, Robb said. I held it from men who would burn it rather than lose it. He glanced briefly at the woman in red and then away. I hold captives. The queen. The boy. Joffrey of houses Baratheon and Lannister, Stannis said. What he names himself is of no import. His birth broke the realm's laws and his mother abetted it. They will answer. They will, Robb said. To you, if we have what we need. Catelyn felt a strange, light heat move through her knees, as if they might let her fall of their own accord in relief. She gripped her own wrist. Stannis's eyes had a heaviness in them like a horizon. Your terms. The North is free. The Riverlands are free. We hold what we held before Aegon came with dragons. We feed our own and we keep our own law. You rule the rest. Stannis looked at the ground and then at the boy's face and back to the ground. The boy was not a boy. He was a king who had not grown into his crown yet and might never. He was Ned Stark's son. Stannis had liked Ned as a man likes a tollkeeper who always gives correct change. The realm's unity has never been an adornment, he said, after a moment. It is not a half-cloak to be thrown over one shoulder and made a fashion. The realm is the thing you fight for because all else turns to mud. The realm you speak of is a story told in summer to make tea. He harvest brag bigger. The great John put in. We remember the last time a southern king kept his word to the north. That was when. He grinned. I was young, mayhap. Silence, Stannis said, and the great John went quiet out of surprise alone. Robb said, the realm you speak of sent my father south to serve justice and cut his head off in front of the September. If you were on the throne then, perhaps the realm would feel different underfoot. It wasn't you. It was your brother's son, or his wife, or their guards. The realm is a hall with too many shadows in it. My lord, I will not bring my people back there. Stannis did not wince, nor did he flinch from the name of a man he had admired and not liked. You speak true where it pleases you. He looked across the water at the Red Keep. Past it, it seemed, to the idea of it. I'll have justice for treason. That is not a word I lower to my boot when the walk is muddy. I do not spit on it and say it's only spittle. Cersei Lannister will answer for her crimes. The boy too. Before the law, Robb said. He had not meant to ask the next thing, and then it was in his mouth. And if they beg for mercy? I am not my brother, Stannis said, and for a heartbeat something too bright to look at moved across his face and was gone again. I do not forgive men for killing my kin or stealing my crown. I am the law's hand. Mercy is a matter for priests. Mercy is a matter for men, said Davos softly as if to himself. Stannis heard him and did not rebuke him. That was mercy of a kind. Melisandre stood with her hands folded and her eyes deep red as a hearth's core. The Lord of Light burns away falsehoods. Break the Iron Throne and build a new one of clean iron. Or burn it, if you have the courage of your mouth. You can burn the chair and call it holiness, Brynden said dryly. Chairs are for sitting, not for worship. Catelyn's hand tightened on her own wrist until she felt bone. Do you accept? She said to Stannis, before the men could speak themselves in circles of their own cleverness. Do you accept my son's terms? Will you spare 1,000 mothers' grief this month? Stannis's jaw worked once. He was a man who had swallowed bitterness in the habit of medicine and kept swallowing it afterward because he no longer knew what else to do. He looked not at Robb, nor past him, but at the space he would occupy in years to come in a history written in hard words and black ink. I will recognize the North's independence, he said, precisely and as if reading a verdict, and the Riverlands' de facto governance under the Tullus for the span of my reign. You will pay tribute in the form of grain when requested at a just measure, and men at need for defense against threats from beyond the wall and from the sea. You will not harbor traitors to my realm. You will deliver to me Cersei Lannister, her children, and those Lannisters held in your custody to answer at King's Landing. You will quit the city in 7 days. If you agree, we are done with each other and may be decent enough not to pretend otherwise. Robb's mouth felt dry as if he had been eating salt. He heard the great John snort at tribute. He saw Brynden's mouth tilt a fraction. He heard Catelyn's breath leave her. I agree, he said, and found that the word, though small, had weight in the hand of his will. The phrase won't like that, Theon muttered in his ear later, after both parties had gone away in the approved fashion and the air had seemed to change color. I don't like it either, Robb said, tired, honest. Your Grace, Theon added after a beat, because there were men nearby who took other men's words seriously. The 7 days that followed had the character of a dream whose edges have been trimmed by a careful hand. Robb moved through the city under tight guard, distributing bread and justice in small measures, and always counting carts, days, promises, wolves. Sansa learned how to walk in daylight without bowing her head. She slept in a place that had not held old fear in its corners, and once, waking in the middle of the night, she reached for something that was not there and found instead the thought of her father, which was like the thought of a wall that did not bend to wind. Tyrion came once to see Robb, and the conversation was not recorded because there were no men present who dared write it down in any language. Later, Catelyn asked her son what had passed between them, and he said, "Sense, and the kind of humor that keeps men alive when their own breath offends their pride." She did not press him. She had begun to think that men built their friendships as spiders built their webs. A net invisible in air that caught the specific flies they needed to live. Rickard Karstark caught a fly of his own. He found 2 young Lannister pages within the city, cowering in a stable where straw had been thrown on stone and forgotten. Perhaps they were cousins, perhaps not. It did not matter to his grief. Karstark had 3 sons when the war began. Now he had none. He walked into the stable and came out with his sword read up to the guard. The boys' bodies looked small as rabbits hanged by their hind legs from the rafters. Robb had him brought before him in a square that had held a market for onions the day before. The smell of onion had not left. Karstark did not deny what he had done, and his face looked like a map of a country after battle, places erased with a knife. "You have cost me more than death," Robb said. His voice did not carry as the speech of kings is supposed to carry. He did not shout, because men do not shout when they are stitching their own standards closed with thread they have stolen from their mothers. "You have cost me law," Karstark spat. "Law failed your father. It fell asleep in its chair and let a boy with junk for guts sit a throne. It is my law now," Robb said, and heard the truth of it as a man hears his own heart. He wanted to be an honorable bee. Again so badly his ribs hurt. He was not. He rose to the measure given. "You will be put to the sword, Lord Karstark." "Then do it yourself," Karstark said, and there was a kind of love in his contempt, the way there is a kind of love in a father who tells his son that fear of pain is not useful, that pain will have you anyway. Or be your grandfather's grandson only, and have a man do it for you. Robb did it himself. The square saw a head fall and knew a king. Karstark's men left the city like a tide going out, quiet and cold. Catelyn wept where no one would see her. Sansa heard the story the way all stories are heard in cities. Half true, twice told, useful. She went to the September and prayed and found that prayer was a rope she could hold rather than a letter she had to write. She thought of her father. She thought of her little brothers and realized with a shock that she had been thinking of them as if they would never grow older and would stay forever in the last bright room she had seen them in at Winterfell, the room with apples on the table and the smell of combed wool in the air. She stood and went out and found her brother. "Will you really go?" she asked. She was not very good at hiding the ache in her voice yet, and did not try. "I cannot stay," he said and smiled, and she thought there was hope in the knowledge. He was not trying to be cruel as a posture. He did not enjoy leaving. He recognized that it was a part of breathing. "You have a different road." "What road?" she asked genuinely. She would have asked anyone, and she was glad it was him because he had not yet learned how to lie even for kindness, and she loved him for that and for being exactly what he was and for being still hers. "To safety," he said, and shook his head at his own thin joke. "The Reach. The Reach." She could not keep the surprise out of her voice. "Lady Olenna Tyrell sent a man with a riddle that did not need solving," Catelyn said, appearing at his side. It had been decided that Catelyn could always make herself appear where people needed to hear truth. "They propose that you wed Lord Willis. Willis is kind and clever by report, and he will not seek to break you. Mace Tyrell wants wallflowers twined around his house and a winter field not to look at but to claim without walking it. We will not give him that. We will give you a place to grow safely on your own feet, and we will take their grain when the wind blows out of the northeast and the sheep die bleeding in pens. It is politics, Sansa. I am sorry. I am glad." Sansa did not speak for a time. Then she said carefully, I met Ser Loras once. He smiled at me. I will not see him where I am going. You will see a man who loves books and gardens, Catelyn said. It is not a poor thing to walk out and see roses one day that were not there before because a man you lived beside thought of you when he ordered his gardeners about. Love is not always the thing that sets the house afire. Sometimes it is a lamp lit at the proper hour. You will have safety, and you may have more than that beside. Sansa looked at her brother. Old plaits tugged at her scalp. She had yet to decide how her hair should fall when no one insisted. Will you be? Theon rode north with the wolves and did not find himself on a spray-slick deck with a salt beard and the smell of old fish in his hair. He did not take Winterfell with 50 men because he never left the boy who had learned to shoot in the gods, would to go beg a father for a crown that was a fool's helm with bits of shell stuck in it. Far away in a chilly hall, a smiler with old eyes tallied the squares on his mental board and found that a certain river crossing had not been paid for with a certain promised thing. Walder Frye pursed his lips as a miser tastes his bread and calculates the crumbs he will save for later. He wrote letters, not one of which said precisely what he meant. He would wait. He had time. He had grandsons as other men had fleas. Tywin Lannister read those letters and others and did not sleep. He was in the west, and his men were not as numerous as they had been yesterday. He had thought to march to King's Landing in company with roses and gold. Instead, the city had fallen to a boy he had dismissed with a thought. He set down his cup and the sound on the table was small and final. He sent out men with messages. He sent out a man with a knife in a boot and a way of moving as if there were one less bone in his spine than other men. Somewhere north of Harrenhal, Arya Stark passed that man on a road and did not know him, and he did not know her, because the world is not as neat as men who write histories pretend. He had other names in his mouth. He spat them into the dust behind him like olive pits. In King's Landing, they opened the great doors and let Stannis in. Robb was not there to see it, but he heard the tale later at an inn whose stew had been better the day before and would be worse the day after. He sat under a low beam and listened to a peddler tell a version of the truth with lavish invention. The Iron Throne looked smaller when Stannis stood before it and did not sit. He did not sit until the Queen and the boy had been brought out. Confession? The peddler said. Like song, comes easiest when the singer knows he'll be hushed soon anyway. It was said that Stannis had not burned them. It was said he had. It was said that he had given them to the headsman in the old way, and that he had stood with his back to the city while it was done, looking at the river as if it had a good answer to a hard question in it. It was said that Tyrion Lannister had smiled once, sharp and private, and then had gone away to a place no one wanted to think about. Robb did not go back to King's Landing. He saw it once from a hill with scrub on it as his column moved north like a gray snake. Sansa went away south with guards sworn to him and comfort that cut, and they brought her to High Garden where the sun had a flavor and roses had purposes. Willis Tyrell did not make her smile at once. He did not try to make her at all. He showed her a hawk with a jess of green leather and asked the right questions. He did not lie about pain. The Queen of Thorns looked her over as if she were a bolt of cloth and not a girl, and then asked her if she knew how to play Syvas, and Sansa said no, and Olenna Tyrell smiled a real smile once, quickly. In the Riverlands, ravens went back and forth like thoughts between enemies. Edmure Tully stood at the fords and felt about his shoulders the weight of a thing he had not asked for and was not good at. Black Walder Frye watched him from the other bank and did some shorter than he should have done. There were men in mail with the sigil of a flayed man who were not where they were supposed to be when the snow began. They went to Dreadfort when they were ordered to come to Winterfell, and they did not tell their horses why. North of Moat Cailin the air altered. It was as if men had been breathing shallowly for months and then took a proper breath and discovered it hurt. Robb rode with his mother to Winterfell, and they did not speak much on the last 3 days because silence is the only language for certain sorts of homecoming. When at last the grey towers rose out of the frost and the walls took the wolf banner and the gates swung back and Hodder said Hodder and wept, Catelyn Stark let her hand fall from her wrist and give up its solid ache. She went under the arch and into the yard, where Bran waited with Maester Luwin and a new gravity to him like a stone tied to the ankle of a boy who had been floating. Rickon tore like a pup toward his brother and wrapped him around the middle and howled into his cloak. and Grey Wind answered in a deep note that made ravens flap a fraction up their branch. Robb dismounted, and his legs failed him briefly, like a boy's after a long race. He went to a knee and laughed once before he could not help crying. He did not wear a crown in that moment. His mother felt the vagrant thought brush her as a bird does as it passes low over a field. She never told him, not then, not later, that it came to her. He had already learned how much heavier the cold was than the iron when worn alone and long. Winterfell took him back into itself. It had been wounded when the Ironborn raided the coasts and took what they could carry when the watch was thin and the wind fat in their sails. But their knives had not opened the castle's arteries. Roderick Castle met his king in the yard and bowed, and then had to lean on his staff to keep his knees from going entirely. "My lord," he said, choking his words. "My boy." He would die later in his sleep after seeing a spring thaw. But for a while he lived and made lists and argued with the cook and sat by the fire with the children and talked of things that had already happened as if holding them still in words might keep them with him. Ravens came and weeks passed, and a council formed itself like frost along a river's edge. Stannis's letters arrived with the character of their maker. Not written but carved. He acknowledged what he had acknowledged. He demanded what he would demand. Grain at need, men. If wildlings came south in number, no harbor for traders who had said they owed him fealty. Robb sent replies that were not beautiful and were wholly clear. The Tyrells sent gifts that were beautiful and wholly unclear. Casks of wine with names longer than men. A tapestry that looked like a story about a garden if you looked with one eye and like a map of a war if with the other. A small chest of seeds that made Maester Luwin smile in a way none of them had seen for months. From the west, silence. Tywin was not a man to write letters that put his mirth on display. From the twins, more letters, thick as soup, saying nothing in 20 ways. Catelyn read each of them twice and felt a chill find its old path up her spine. Brynden went out to visit Lord Walder and returned with his cheeks chapped and his jaw set, and he said, "The old spider by the river counts not coin but slights. He'll count our stepping around his promise, as if it were an insult given in his own hall on a name day." "We made no oath," Robb said, and looked at his mother and then away. Not yet. He was young enough that the yet stung him, and old enough to have put it in the right place in the sentence. "Words have weight when spoken by men who do not like to speak them," Brynden said. He wanted the weight more than the words. "We'll find another way," Catelyn said. "Perhaps he will find one as well." She looked at the window where a snowflake had stuck and melted. "There are feasts for forgiveness." "Forgiveness is a small mouth trying to eat a large loaf," Brynden said. "The old man is all teeth and no stomach." Spring would be late. The first true storm came down out of the north like a cloak being thrown over a bed. It lay on the King's Road and made it a rumor. It made men walk carefully. It made ravens hesitate. By then Robb had grown a beard he was not proud of and had learned to sleep in 3 stretches a night because one long stretch made him dream of chains being raised in fog. Theon took to the ice like a boy to a new reckless pleasure, laughing once and then catching himself because he was not the boy he had been. He fought well that winter, and it saved him quietly as good habits save men who had almost lost the trick of them. Rickard Karstark's sons were dead, and so he could not go to their father's cairn to say the words. He said them in the Godswood and meant them. Roose Bolton's eyes watched him sometimes and did not blink. There was always a letter from the wall, with sober words and grim humor that did not translate below the neck but was appreciated anyway. Mance Rayder's name came up like a whale's back in a gray sea and went under again. Stannis's men had raiders at their coast that did not all bear the kraken. Tales began of a pale queen in the east with a clutch of children that were not human. Catelyn put that letter down and went, without a word, into the Godswood and sat a long time until her fingers got too cold to feel their own shape. Sansa wrote from the Reach. She told of oranges and men who smiled without malice, of Olenna's tongue like a blade that cut every man to the length he deserved, of Willis who had hands that smelled of rosemary and earth and who had shown her where a nightingale nested. She wrote of nights she slept with windows open because the air itself seemed to want to be in the room. She wrote, once, of a day she had not wept and had not had to remind herself not to, and of how scared that had made her afterward. "They will sing of you," Willis had told her, in a courtyard of blue tile when she had told him simply and without decoration of her father's last moments. "Or perhaps I will write it down in a book when I am an old man and they have forgotten the song." She had laughed then, a little, like a girl who is tickled but does not wish to pretend it was not her own laughter. Stannis sent no songs. He sent, once, a gift no one could have expected. A smith. The man came north swearing and had hands like hams and eyes like a blacksmith's eyes that see the real thing being born where none saw it before. He taught men to lay steel in a way that did not break, and Robb made him a place at table and sent Stannis a letter without any sweetening thanking him. Davos sent a letter, too, in his own hand at a later date which said, "I saw you count the cost and pay it and go home. Men will call you wise for years for doing the thing you did because no one died on the river to teach them a new song that day. I know the song we did not sing and am glad for it, though it is not the song I dreamed. When spring did come, it came grudging and chewed at the corners of the world as if it resented waking. The north turned green in smudges. Catelyn walked the walls of Winterfell at dawn and saw smoke rise straight for the first time in weeks and thought, the air is holding its breath differently. She stopped beside a merlin and pressed her palms flat to the stone and found it warm at last. She closed her eyes and saw Ned's face as she always saw it. Serious, clear, as if law had a mouth and he'd been its tongue. She could not tell him this story, and she had never been certain which stories he would have wanted to hear. She found she could tell it to herself and count that enough. On a morning fair and hard as a new coin, Robb went down to the yard to see Bran work with the bow and Rickon with a stuffed spear. He laughed, because Rickon took to the spear like a pup takes to a stick and had to be told it was not a thing for catching but for holding level. Bran was patient now, more patient than a boy should be. Patience sat awkwardly on him and he wore it anyway. Hodder said Hodder at the right time and laughed at his own correctness. The sound echoed off the stones like the very idea of home being pleased with itself. Later that day, a raven arrived with a letter marked only with a hand that had gone too long without warmth. It spoke of movements in the Riverlands and a wedding, with a great deal of meat and a table laid for more than the number of men under the roof, and a song that had been forbidden once played too openly. Brynden read it and did not show it to Robb until evening. "You will not go," he said when he did. "The old man has gathered all the knives he owns and some he borrowed. He will spend them." Robb took the letter and let it sit in his hand like a live thing that did not know whether to bite. He looked at his mother and saw in her face the knowledge before he had finished thinking it. "No," he said. He said it again to teach his mouth the word. "No. We will hold a feast of our own when the river is green. We will send gifts, pretty ones his grandchildren will squabble over." Catelyn's hand found his sleeve and squeezed once, as once she had caught his hand before he would take a step into a stream he had thought not deep. Yes, he did not go. Other men went from other houses. Some did not return, and the story that grew around that night had its own gravity that bent the light of truth as it left the event. They would say later that the king in the north had known. They would say later that he had read the weather and not put his men under a roof that had a knife in it. They would make a story out of his caution and forget his weariness and the sharp grief that woke him once in the night and made him stand under the heart tree and put his hand against the cold. It is the way of songs to smooth the right places and leave rough those that do not rhyme. The war did not end. Wars never do. They turn and change and become memory, and then another war is born out of their bones. In the south, Stannis dealt his justice and paid for every judgment in coin that had his own face on it. He set a hand on the city and tried to make its bones his. He fought the West in ways that did not always look like fighting. He worried at the Rock with letters and hunger when he could not with spears. The Tyrells built gardens on top of walls and grew spies among the hedges and told jokes with knives in them. Varys spun webs and waited. Littlefinger bought and sold men as if they were fields and he were improving the drainage. Men forgot the fog sometimes. Sometimes it came to them on hot days like a trick of scent. And in the north there were wolves. Robb took his men and went among the holds and reminded them that winter had not died of a wound in a southern city. He learned to sleep where he found himself. He learned again the names of hills he had known as a boy and traded them for the names of men who held loyalty to their hearths before anything written on parchment. He sat in hall after hall where smoke rose to rafters and made patterns that looked like old gods listening. He said no to 10 petitions for everyone he said yes to, and half the men who heard no praised him and half cursed, and both would die for him anyway when Hornblast called. Sansa wrote of fruit ripening in the sun, and of the first time a small boy with Tyrell green on his sleeve had called her "my lady," without mockery or calculation. Willis sent a hawk to Robb, in a beautiful cage, and Robb sent the cage back with a note that said, "Thank you for the thing that can fly." The hawk grew mild under Sansa's hand and brought back to her small wild things until she relearned how to look on death without thinking only of one day under one sky. Olenna spoke to her of names and power and fed her a story about a girl who had not been eaten by a wolf because she had learned to make herself taste like something the wolf did not like. Sansa laughed at that because she knew that if a wolf loved you it would not eat you, and if it did not you would be clever or you would die. She remembered, in that laugh, the smell of gray wind and fog, like iron and morning. Night came earlier in the north, even in summer, and the men on the walls watched it come. A boy's voice cracked and became a man's just as the first star appeared one night. In the God's Wood, Bran listened to leaves, and sometimes they seemed to be talking about things that had not happened yet. Rickon learned 3 new curses and a prayer and decided which he liked. Robb walked the high wall and stopped and leaned and let his shoulders relax. He could hear, faint but sure, the low sound of life in the castle under him. Pot lids clashing, a woman singing to a child, a dog in its sleep chasing something it would never catch, Hodder saying Hodder and laughing at a joke he told himself. He looked out across the black fields and thought, unreasonably and exactly, "I want 1 quiet year." Then he smiled at himself for the wish. He had won something else instead, the chance to be needed repeatedly by the same people for years on end. He found that sat on him not as a yoke but as a cloak he had wanted as a boy. It was heavy and smelled of smoke and snow. When the first snows of the next winter fell, thick as lamb's wool on the shoulders of men and beasts, there would be work to do. There are always walls to mend and men to punish and men to forgive. There are always letters to send and to burn. The nights north of the Neck would stretch long and dream dark, and the children of the forest would hide in stories told so that fear might learn new feet. But for a while, in the holdfasts from White Harbor to Barrowton, in the halls of the Mountains of the Moon, and in scattered farms where the cattle's breath rose like spells, men told each other the tale of the night the wolves took the city. They told it with more fog and more bells each time, and they saved a place in the telling for the note at the end, the one that was not a moral but a feeling. That a thing could be taken in blood and given back in a bargain. That mercy had been a man's work and not the gods'. That a girl had walked out of a hall and not looked back and had gone south to find a part of herself she had been told to tear out and feed to a king and had refused. That a boy had read his name in the face of a river and learnt how to say no at the proper markers. Far to the south, a man with a red scar crossed his cheek, set a piece on a board and smiled without humor at the shape the game had taken. Far to the east, a woman on a different throne learned the first note of a song made of fire. The wall waited. The gods, if there were gods who listened, leaned to hear a story retold with less blood each time, which is a kind of holiness men may claim for themselves. On a night when the sky was clean and the cold had the taste of iron in it, Robb stood alone beneath the empty boughs of the heart tree. Snow lay about him like truth. He said no prayer out loud. He put his hand on the bark and felt, the way men swear they feel the sea's heart when they put an ear to a shell, the slow flood of the land's long breath. He did not know how many men would call what he had done wise, and how many would call it cowardice, and how many would not call it anything at all. He thought of fog and law and the weight of a head in his hands and the soft heat of a sister's hair under his mouth when he kissed her brow. He thought of the shape of a chair no one he loved would sit. He thought of a road that did not wrap around his throat like a chain. He thought of winter. He smiled and his breath came white out of him and held its shape a moment like a speech he had not spoken. Then the wind tore it and made it nothing again, which is what wind does, and men keep speaking anyway. He turned and went back into his house, and behind him the tree stood and said nothing to the snow, which said nothing back. Snow scratched at the windows in the mornings now, a thin gray sound like a quill over bad parchment. The days were brief and bright as pennyweights. The nights arrived early and sat heavy, and men went out with lanterns even to go from one door to another. Winterfell ate wood like a great, mild beast that did not mean harm but could not help its appetite. The smell of smoke sank into cloth and beard and hair and lived there. Robb was beginning to enjoy it, the way a man enjoys a familiar ache that tells him the bone has set. Letters came every day. Most carried the small, practical lives of 100 places. Grain counted, sheep gone to thinness, a sick child in a lord's hall that required a midwife out of Winterfell. Others were heavier, the paper thick and the wax fussy. Brynden Tully had a way of standing just so when he entered with one of those in his hand, as if to say, "I bring you the piece on the board that moves only once." The Hornwood letter came between a request for horseshoes and a list of men who'd broken their spears training and wanted the smith to rap their knuckles or the quartermaster to forgive them. It bore the stag of House Hornwood in cheap brown wax and had been sealed on the rough side of a table, and it smelled of smoke that had not seen sweet wood for too long. Catelyn read it twice, then again aloud to her son. Donella Hornwood's neat hand set down simple words the way a woman sets pieces of bread on a platter. "My Lord King, I am pressed on all sides. There are men who come to my hall unbidden. A bastard from the Dreadfort makes claims upon my person. My men are scarce and my house is poor. I ask for your protection as I swore to your father and to the kings before him." "Ramsay," said Brynden at the window, the snow's scratch as intimate as breath. "Roose's get by the miller's daughter. He is a seed that grew where no one looked long enough." Catelyn's mouth made a thin line, and she looked older then than she had when fog had clung to her son's hair in King's Landing. "He stole her lands in a night. In the books men write to amuse themselves. In life he will take nights and nights, and hope we look away. We will not." Robb had his hands on either side of the table, the knuckles white. Winterfell did not forgive men who took its loyal houses and chewed them. Donella Hornwood had fed his father and given him a hound when he was 10. "Send Hal Malin with a company," he said. "No, not Hal. He makes too much noise when matters call for quiet. Tallheart. Leobald Tallheart will obey, but he is near to the Bar-Rollins and has his own bands to feed," Brynden said. "Galbart Glover is at Deepwood Motte. His brother Robert with you. Torrance Square has men still, though old Lord Tallheart's ill. Roderick can go. He needs to be reminded that his sword was not made to rust by a warm fire." "Ser Roderick," Robb said, and the name sat easy in his mouth. "With 50. Swift and keep to the trees when you can. Bring Lady Hornwood to Winterfell if she is willing." He put a finger flat to the letter. "If she is not, strip the Dreadfort's bastard off her like a tick." "Roose will not thank you for the killing of his blood," Catelyn said, not as a rebuke, but as a laying of a stone where it must go. "Roose," Robb said, "has not thanked me for much." They had not quarreled. Bolton did not quarrel. He accepted terms the way a snake accepts sunlight on a rock, as a thing that did not change its nature. Robb wrote to Roose Bolton that day with a crisp hand and no heat in the words. "Your bastard menaces one sworn to Winterfell. Take him in hand, else I will." The letter went out with the raven that liked to peck at rings. On the morrow, Roderick Castle, his whiskers combed up to his cheekbones, rode out with 50 spears and a strip of salted pork he tucked into his saddlebag as if that would persuade anyone of anything except that he loved meat. 2 days later another letter came, bent and damp. The seal had cracked in the cold, and the words inside looked as though they'd been penned by a hand that had already decided to leave the pen and go live somewhere less patient. Robert Glover's hand this time, for Galbart. "The stony shore burns," it said. "Raid on the rills. Men out of the sea, with black oars and laughter that stinks of old fish. Deepwood is threatened. Theon Br. Audit to his king without comment." He had gone quieter since they had crossed back under the Winterfell arch. He was alert, and sometimes he laughed in a way that made other men look up quick to see if he meant them harm, then grin in relief when he did not. He had taken the ice like a child to a mirror and had been the first to fall through it, and to laugh at himself soaked to the waist and blue at the lips while Osha cuffed him and said a string of words in the old tongue that might have curled the ice thicker. He handed Robb the letter and did not speak until the king looked up. "My father has never been a patient man." "You think it him?" Brynden said, mild. He did not have to say that the ink smell of pike lay on the words. "I think he wanted to be thought king again before the sea took him," Theon said. His mouth made a shape not unlike a smile. It was not a kind smile, but it wasn't an unkind one either. "He does not much like that. I am not in his hall to be shouted at." "Is it him?" Robb asked, blunt. "Or your sister? Or the other one with his God's Bible and his ships all in neat rows?" Theon's eyes were very dark today. "Asha could do it with 40 men and a laugh," he said. "Victarion could do it with 100 and count himself cheated of glory. My father would bid them and sit in a chair with a blanket and look at the waves with an old man's anger. Euron, if he is back." Euron would do it and put a bird upon his shoulder and tell the bird a joke and teach it how to peck out eyes. "But he's gone." "Men thought Stannis gone from the lists," Brynden said. "And he wrote himself down again in better ink." Robb looked at the letter and refused to rub at the ache that had found its favorite place under his ribs. Mance Rayder, Winter, Ramsay Snow, Iron Men on the stony shore. It was like standing before 3 doors in the dark and hearing, behind each, a sound you had learned to fear. He wanted to be back in the cold harbor fog with a straight problem, a gate and a chain and a timing. The North was not a gate. It was 100 doors and 1,000 hands, some outstretched, some closed. "Galbart holds Deepwood," Catelyn said. "He will not break." "He may starve," Robb said. "And starving is a kind of break. A man doesn't always bang and crash while he does." He put a finger to the map. "We go west. Roderick to Hornwood and back to us if he can. Else to Torrhen Square with a message for Leopold Tallheart to hold in Harry. The Great John to Barrowton to watch the Bar Rollins against men out of the sea. Manderley sends ships. Wyman will grumble at leaving White Harbor with the seamen biting. But he'll send them anyway and swear he's a better cook than a sailor. We go west, and we take Deepwood if it's taken. And if it's not, we pull the Ironmen's beards until they cry out their god's name and run back to boats." "We?" Theon repeated, the "we" sitting in his mouth like spring berries no one else had picked yet. "You?" Robb said, looking at him. "Do you want another place?" He let the question rest naked. Theon looked away out the window a long while, until the snow scratch ceased and that particular gray silence changed to another. "No," he said, "I'm weary of choosing other places. I will go west with you, and I will kill the men in iron who come for my father's sake." He turned his head and grinned, the old grin for a heartbeat. "I will not shout their names while I do it." Catelyn said nothing, which was her way of praise these days. Before they rode, 2 ravens arrived together like a proverb that means to be remembered. One bore a seal of yellow wax impressed with a stag within a heart of fire. The other had no seal at all and a thread tied around it. Stannis's letter was sharpened to a point. You could cut bread with it. He wrote in a firm, tight script that admitted no moodiness. He announced by these presents the execution of Cersei Lannister for the murders of King Robert Baratheon and Lord Eddard Stark and for treason, the execution of Joffrey Waters for high treason and misrule, the placing of Tommen and Myrcella Waters under custody of the crown for judgment to be rendered upon passage into lawful age. He had not burned them. He made point of that without making a song. The law has ways. The law suffices. The law should be seen to suffice. The unsealed letter smelled faintly of orange peel, as if it had been kept near fruit. Robb recognized the hand after the second line. Sansa wrote of gardens and hawks and of Lady Olenna's sharpness that did not cut children. She wrote of Willis and did not gild him fancy. She said he was kind and clever and not a bad listener. She wrote that she had wept when she heard a certain thing and had not been ashamed. "It pleases me to think a thing has an ending that is not a song," she wrote in that clear, careful hand. "But I am glad for it." She did not name Cersei. She spoke of Tommen last, as if she had been afraid to say his name. "They say he is to be sent to Oldtown to be a scribe, or to the Wall to be a steward. I wish him books," she said. The words were plain and heavy as bread. Robb put that letter away in his belt. When he rode under Winterfell's arch, he turned in his saddle and sat for a moment gentle with his men and his mother. He lifted a hand to Bran and Rickon and Hodder and Osha arranged behind them like a small, odd court. Bran waved. Rickon howled. Grey wind pressed his cold nose against Catelyn's palm. And for a heartbeat the world was a smaller thing. A yard, a door, a table, a dog asleep on the rushes. Then he turned his mount and went out into weather. The road west did what winter roads do. Made men quiet and made food precious. They passed small steadings where a mother would come out to stand and watch them go by, not smiling because smiles were for safety in spring. They found once a man hanged from a birch with a bit of bread tied in a rag to his belt. Theon cut him down and put the bread into a child's hand without ceremony. They crossed streams crusted thin with ice and went slow so their horses would not break through. They saw smoke on horizons that had not seen it a week before. Robert Glover met them at a place where 2 black pines made a gate over a ditch. He had a beard scruffier than befit a lord and a bandage round one arm that he ignored. His face he kept careful until he'd pushed his horse up close enough to grasp Robb's forearm, and then it fell for a heartbeat into something like the expression of a boy who has finally found his father at a fair. "They're on the shore," he said flat. They took a hamlet by the rills and lit it as if fire were a woman they meant to show off. "How many?" Robb asked. 2 longships worth, maybe a third. They don't go inland. They like to smell their piss on the spray. Harlaw men, I think by the sigils, silver scythes on black, and some with a driftwood crown on their bits of rag. "Victorian men," Theon said. He did not sound pleased. "Deepwood?" Robb asked. "Holding," Robert said, and the word came like a little coin he knew he had and wanted not to spend. "We can keep them from doing worse than they have if we punch them hard and push them back to their boats. It will be messy." "We are good at messy," Theon said. "We were raised in it, some of us." They hit at dawn, the cold cutting well and the mist lying low over the shingle, so that men came up out of it like propositions in a loud room. The Iron Men had dragged their boats up beyond the Titterline and were sleeping between them, as men do who think anyone who hates them must come by water or else out of their own likeness. Robb sent Blackwood's men along the tree line to come down like a hawk when he moved. The Great John he kept beside him, as much for the pleasure of watching the man fight as for the man's usefulness as a battering ram. Grey wind went ahead when the words grew too many in Robb's chest. Later, a boy whose hand shook when he talked would say he had thought the wolf was smoke or a fog wisp until it struck the first man and the sound came. Meat and bone with a short, ugly music. Theon went in with a spear and then cast it aside because a spear kept a man too far from the faces he had to speak to. He took a seeks from a man who told him in a delighted voice that he used to fish. Blackwood's archers were patient and opened their throats only when it counted. The Iron Men cried to the drowned god with more fear at the end than faith. At the waterline their boots slipped and they looked like crab walkers, and one of them began to laugh and could not stop even as a blade found his belly. After, Robb stood on the shingle where the tide kissed his boots and looked at the boats. "Burn them," he said. "Drag the keels up under the trees and burn them with good northern wood." "Sacrilege," one of the captured Iron Men said with the flat certainty of a man who has never considered that other men might not believe in his god. "Maybe it will keep him warm," Theon said, not unkindly, "if he is not as drowned as he thinks." They found a boy under a boat with his thumb in his mouth and a bit of bone in his hand that he'd whittled at. Theon lifted the canvas and crouched and spoke very soft. "What's your name, little fish?" "He doesn't have one," Robb said. "He was meant to drown before he opened his eyes." His tone made it seem a thing he had read once and put away on the shelf of his mind. He reached for the boy and the boy scuttled sideways like a spider. Theon laughed under his breath and, ignoring the men around him, put the Sikhs down on the shingle and backed away 2 paces. He folded himself and sat. After a while the boy looked at him through salt-tangled hair. "You can call yourself anything," Theon said. "My father called me many names, and few were worth their spit. Choose one. Choose one with teeth." The boy said nothing a long time. Then, "Tide." It was uncertain, as if he had tried on a shirt with a collar he wasn't used to. "Well then, Tide," Theon said solemn. "Let us fetch you to a hall that has warmth in it and find you a thing to do that isn't dying." Men watched him and did not speak the thing in their heads because to speak it would make it smaller and meaner than it was. Deepwood Mott did not fall. Galbart Glover wrote it into his men's bones that wood and patience take better bite than stone and pride when the enemy comes half by sea and half by habit. The Iron Men raided and retreated, until men began to say the word raid in their sleep without waking to know why. Robb remained 9 days and made the shore unprofitable and sent 2 of the captured boats to White Harbor with a message for Manderley. Send ships here. We will keep them long enough for you to cut their ropes. The men who took those boats were not iron-born. They were small men of the rills who did not look back from the oars because looking back counted as a kind of prayer they had not learned. On the 10th day, a raven came down like a thought that had been deferred and remembered at last. It bore Roose Bolton's device, neat and smirking, stamped with care. My bastard is at large, his letter said without apology, as if he wrote of a hound that had worried sheep. He has taken a wife unlawfully. He has taken lands unlawfully. I am chastened. I have given orders for him to return and to answer for his crimes. He has not returned. Send him to me for justice, if you get him into your hand, and I shall show you how justice is done at the Dreadfort. Justice at the Dreadfort, the great John said, and spat so that his spit lay white on the frozen ground. Aye, and salt beer feeds a man. Ramsay will run, Brynden said. He is built to run like a ferret. If we chase him, he'll lead us to places our horses can't go well. We need a net. We need a dog that can smell through snow. Grey Wind lifted his head as if hearing his name without hearing it. Robb sent word back to Winterfell why. Robert Glover to swell the household guard and admit no man who could not be named by 2 others of long standing. He sent Roderick Castle word to bring Lady Hornwood under escort to Winterfell if he had not yet done so, to keep her under watch and comfort both. He sent Theon with 20 to watch the old mill road that ran like a black vein through the Hornwood and toward the Umber lands. Don't chase him, he warned. You'd be good at chasing, and he'll make you happy to use the part of yourself you hate best. Theon grinned as if it were a cleverness at his own expense and saluted with a flourish borrowed out of a book. He rode at once without sleep and hummed under his breath the way boys hum when they play at nights because the body remembers how to be 15 even when the mind knows better. He did not chase. He lay in wait where a copse made a blind and watched the road with eyes that had learned to see men the way the sea sees them, small and lost when they are not in a boat. On the 3rd day he saw a thin bent man leading 2 mules with sticks hung with meat. Theon did not move. The mule's breath went white and pretty. The man's shadow looked like a stick with a knot. Theon waited because the boy in him would have shot and the man had learned the sweetness of patience. When the mules had gone 50 paces past, the meat lifted its dripping head and let out a thin whine. A man slid out from tree shadow behind, fast and low, and hissed, "Quiet!" Theon smiled with his teeth. He had his men wait until the thin man with the mules and the man who crept had both come even with him, and then he took them together, gentle and clean as a good butcher takes 2 rabbits' necks in one hand. Ramsay Snow did not beg. He did not smile either. His eyes did something that, if it happened to a dog, you killed it on the spot to spare it. "You know me," he said to Theon, as if the words were probably true about any man worth talking to. "I know your works," Theon said. He had known another bastard once and called him friend. He looked at this one and could not find a boy in him. "Your father writes pretty letters." "I prefer deeds," Ramsay said, and when Theon struck him once with the butt of a spear he bit it. He drew blood with his teeth and looked pleased with the taste. Theon's men bound him tighter. "You'll take me to the king," Ramsay said then, almost idly. "The king will trim me. I will grow again. Some plants are like that." "I'll take you to the Lady Hornwood," Theon said, and liked the surprise on the bastard's face. "She has a word or 2 to say that I think we should all listen to." Roderick had brought her to Winterfell after a small, brave standoff in her hall where she had stood with a poker in hand and a boy behind her and said, "I am a lady of the north and I have seen worse men than you," and Ramsay had laughed and said something about pigs and winter bacon that made the boy vomit, which made Ramsay slap him lovingly. She came to Winterfell white-faced and furious and did not need warmth pressed into her hands to know she would be kept. She sat in Catelyn's solar and spoke low and used very few adjectives and squeezed her own wrist in a way Catelyn recognized. When they set Ramsay in the square and took off the sack he had been wearing over his head and the people saw his face, there was a sound like a yard of raw silk rubbed briskly. Not fear. Recognition, the way a city recognizes a rat it has named and learned to beat to death. Robb came himself because this was law and not vengeance, though it had both in it. You have stolen a lady and lands that are not yours and a name that is not yours, and you have made fear where duty should live, he said. He had washed his face and arms and made himself neat because this was for Winterfell, not for a field. You have killed without sanction and not in war. Do you deny this? Ramsay looked around him as if searching for a friend he wanted to share a joke with. His eyes were a pale accident. Names are made out of breath, he said. They break when men cough. I deny nothing. I proclaim opportunity. I make myself. Robb looked at Roose Bolton, standing with his gray eyes like good steel under winter light. Your son, he said. Bastard, Roose said. He did not blink. Do as you must. I am wounded by him. Are you? Theon said softly, and Robb's head turned a fraction. Then away. They did law in the square. The old gods do not love axes more than swords, but they do not love less. Robb did not send this to another man. He drew his own blade and hewed cleanly. When the head fell there was no cheer. Men breathed out and moved on, and women took children away to wash their faces and keep them from thinking more than is good for a child to think. Roose Bolton bowed his head the precise amount and walked away with a piece of winter in his gait that had not been there in autumn. If he hated, he hid it under a cloth so thick nothing warm could escape. Watch him, Catelyn said to Brynden, when the square had returned to being a place where cats quarreled over scraps and the winter sun made the puddles bright. Watch him the way you watch a field you know is full of holes. I have hounds, Brynden said, and smiled once, grim and thin and pleased with nothing but the truth. Word came from the wall as the first true thaw spoke through the trees. The letter was sober as always and did not play at drama. It was from the old bear's hand and had a hair in the wax. Men in number, tents like a town in motion, fires on the frostfangs. The wildlings have taken the fist. Our men bled there and then they bled the cold. The winds have a voice I do not care for and the crows move low, slow, and far. We need men. If you cannot send men, send grain. If you cannot send grain, send prayer and do not stop sending it. Robb read it aloud to the men who would have to give their sons and then again to his mother in private. He did not ask aloud if the letter could be exaggerated. He knew it wasn't. He had hunted enough winters to understand the way the air was listening. He wrote at once to Stannis. The North will honor its pledge. He wrote to Manderley for ships and grain and men, to the Umbers for the great horns, to Lady Meage Mormont for every woman who could hold a spear right and shout orders right, to the Flints for their eyes, to the mountain clans for their rage. He wrote to White Harbor that the boy named Tide should be given work in the kitchens and taught to walk on boards without falling into a pot. Will you go yourself? Catelyn asked, though she knew. She had lived long enough in a house of men who thought themselves immortal until winter proved otherwise. She knew how to ask the question that has only one answer, not because the answer is set but because the man is. I will go, Robb said. I sent men to die with my name in their mouths south in summer. I will go north in winter to meet the men who come with winter in theirs. Catelyn held her balance as on ice. And the Ironborn? We've pushed them back so far for now, he said. They will return, or their equals. The sea never tires. But a wall is a wall, and if it falls, it makes the next thing smaller. I will not have the North smaller. Right to the Reach, Brynden said, practical. The Tyrells sell grain for soft words. Sansa will make you a cleverer letter. She will, Catelyn said, soft. And there was a piece of peace in the knowledge that did not belong to politics, and she hugged it once to herself in secret before she folded it away. The letter Sansa wrote for her brother came on thick paper that smelled faintly of lavender. It spoke to Mace Tyrell like a woman of 40 who had spent 20 years managing a house bigger than any man's pride. It talked of grain and of gold reserves and of ships and of nets. and it promised a gift of pelts whose quality could not be matched south of the neck. It said please once and then did not say it again. It set down a date for a caravan to leave Bitterbridge with flour and salted mutton and smoked eels. It did not mention winter's teeth or men with blue hands. It did not need to. Sansa wrote a different letter to her brother that night by a window where night-blooming jasmine opened and shut its small white mouths as if speaking in a language too slight for men to hear. She wrote of Olenna's laughter when she cussed the Reach for their belief that men were born knowing bread rises because it is their right to be fed. She wrote of Willis reading aloud from a book of herbs and then looking up with that particular look he had that meant he'd remembered a line in a play she'd not read. She wrote, "Do not be noble to your own hurt if it will not salve a wound in someone else." She wrote, "I dream sometimes of snow in the courtyard and it is not a bad dream anymore." She wrote, "I think men always thought me soft because I like songs. I like songs still, but now I think I would like to write one which is different." Robb rode north with 3,000, and every step felt like a sentence he still needed to write. He slept in cloak stiff with frost and woke with ice in his beard and did not mind. Grey wind ranged ahead and came back with bits of smell on him. Hare and fox, and once a smell that made the hair on Robb's arms prickle and made the wolf pace and whine low in his throat. He saw it in dreams too, sometimes. A cold so cold it had forgotten itself and become a thing that moved, edges of light that did not warm and did not bend. Men who were not men and the wind making their closed mouths to sing through. He did not wake sweating. When you are cold enough the sweat is elsewhere. He woke and put his hand on Grey Wind's shoulder and let the steadiness come up into him out of the animal, the way a man will take hold of a post when his knees decide to think without his head's permission. They were a day south of Queen's Crown when the scouting party came back with faces that had decided how to look before the men wearing them could think. A host, Edmure's man said, which meant he had borrowed the word because the thing he had seen was too much for words he owned. A town of them, wildlings, women and children and men like old oak trees and boys with spears. Giants, my lord. Giants, the great John said, pleased. I shouldn't like to die before I see one. I shouldn't like to die after neither, Blackwood said dry, as if death might take directions. The old bear met them at the shadow tower with a face like the wall itself. Stone in human shape, with eyes that had learned to be flint in a land where nothing soft lasted unless it had a trick. He embraced Robb as men embrace when both know this is an indulgence the weather doesn't bear. Your father would have come, he said, because it was the thing to say and because it was true. We will not know until afterward where to put that truth in what we tell boys. Tell them to come early, Robb said. It feels good in the mouth and it is almost always wise. They walked the wall together, a black ribbon under a sky like iron, and looked out at the white on white of the world where men were coming who wanted to live. Mance, Robb said, because he knew the name mattered and it was good to say a man's name where the wind could take it. He has no hate for us as men hate. He has hunger and need and a cold behind him with teeth in it. He has raiders and killers and men who call themselves kings because no one learned them better, Mormont said without spite. He has men who will come under the wall and take sheep and girls and kill old men and call it good enough. He has men like you, I will not lie. He has men who would not screw a man they stabbed to death for a scrap of bread, and he has those who would. He is a king. He will not bend his knee to a boy, even if the boy is twice the king the South called theirs. We must not pretend the wall can hold if men are not added to it, Robb said. Wood rots in water. Stone disintegrates under breath. Men stand or they do not. We have 200, the old bear said. He did not make a song of his poverty. We have black mules and hard bread. We have boys with stones and old men with memories of when there were men enough. We have ravens. We have 1 or 2 good archers and 1 or 2 good blades and a store of oil not matched in my lifetime. We have high ground. It is enough if you've sense. We will be sense, Robb said. He set his men east and west along the wall's foot where the ground allowed and where the river's sharp bend could not be used against them. He put archers in stands and copses he could reinforce if the giants came south with their great mammoth hides and their crude bone clubs. He assigned the mountain clans the business of killing men who considered themselves clever for coming around the side, as if men had never thought of that before. He sent the Umbers a long way out to insult every man who might be insulted and to run like heathens back through the snow like boys tempting a bull. He placed Blackwood where patience might make hard miracles. He did not sleep the night the wildlings showed their full frame. There were fires like scattered jewels on the plain, and a whisper that went through the northern men not unlike admiration. "They are many," said the great John, appreciative. "I should like to drink a great deal and fight them all day if it were spring and my bones were younger." "It is not spring," Brynden said. "And if you drink a great deal I will trip you into a ditch by accident while the giants trample by and say, 'Oh, what a pity.'" Robb smiled without showing teeth. He thought then of Jon, who had not written and could not have, and of boys on both sides who would die because men older than they believed the law the gods had made at the sky's beginning had included the clause. Men will always do the thing they think proves them more alive. He leaned his hands on the stone and did not pray. That was for those who could take comfort in being heard. He thought the way a smith thinks, measuring metal and fire. They sent their first wave before dawn, the wildlings, not with drums but with the thin brave sound of men who have never seen themselves as a wave before. They came under the wall in the places men had come under it always, an ice foot that the river could not cut in this particular winter, a low hill of stones thrown up by time down the way, a stand of scrub that hid until men were inside of it and then showed itself as sticks that would slow you when you needed swiftness. Robb's arrows answered, not many, but well placed. Men fell into the dark water and came up gasping and then did not come up. A giant put one hand upon the ice and leaned and broke the place where the river pretended to be ground. Men cried out and laughed madly. The dawn let the world see what it had done and did not apologize. Toward midday a band came straight for the Kingsroad Gate, as if lines on maps drawn by men were a kind of magic that would admit them. They had a man at their head with a helm studded with little chips of bone, and a woman with a longbow whose arrows had bright fletching. Robb thought of stories from his own childhood of evil kings and brave men, and he felt a deep relief that the world did not feel that way to him now. The world was messy and particular. The man with the bone helm died with a sound like a pot forced suddenly into cold water. The woman shot 2 men through the throat in neat succession and then was in the river, and the weight of her wet hair pulled her under, and she did not have time to regret. In the middle watch of the night, the horns sounded low from the east and then short and loud from the west. The mammoths came, their shaggy heads making a line that would have been comical if not for their size. The giants walked with them and shouted in those voices like fallen logs rolling. The wall did what a wall can do. It held. Men on top looked small and made showers of death. The mammoths did what mammoths can do. They pushed. One gate keened like a woman and then did not keen anymore. The iron held and men's fingers burned through their gloves on it, and their skin came away. The giant who led the others ran with a boy's awkward eagerness and fell with a great sound that made a part of Robb laugh before his stomach remembered how it was supposed to feel. It went on that way for hours and much of a day. Men died well and cruelly and badly, and as if they had never died before. Men lived because their boot was in the right place when a spear came for their belly, and because the man to their left fell and pulled them with him under a stroke. If there were gods, they took notes of none of it. If there were shadows of gods, they took notes of all of it. At dusk, Robb heard a shout not like men at war but like men at proof. Proof that the world had finally reached out and touched their fear with a hand that was weightless and which, for that reason, was unbearable. They came quiet, the others, as if wind had learned to walk. They were not a host. Hosts have men who piss and men who eat and men who sing songs to girls they think will like them after. They had no men, only shapes made out of cold that had forgotten mercy. They moved among the wildlings like teachers and touched men and made them artists of a new kind of dance that ended in stillness. They looked up once at the wall as if it were an uninteresting problem. They did not try to come over. They went away into the white and did not care how many mouths the watchers opened. 7, someone whispered, ridiculous as a child wishing into a well. 7, Robb said, and found he could make his voice brave not by standing against fear, but by admitting it had come and putting his back against it like a thing that could hold him up. We do not stand against them tonight. Not tonight. He shouted, Hold! Hold steady! And men held, because the next order you can follow is good enough. He sent men to put oil where oil had not yet been and to put arrows where arrows had been but needed more. When dawn came, the cold shapes were gone. The wildlings had fewer fires. The King's Road gate was still a gate. The giants moved further west and the mammoths with them, and the sound of their great bodies made the ground honest a long way. When it was done being a battle and became once again a cusp where men remembered they might eat, Robb went down among his men. He fought with his sword drawn because that was what they needed him to look like. He did not use it much because he had given it away to the right men when it would matter most. He found a dead boy whose mouth still looked surprised. He moved the boy's hand and closed it on the boy's own cloak to thread a meaning through a life that had ended without one. He found Blackwood, who had a cut on his cheek that would scar nicely, and the Great John, who was laughing. He found Roose Bolton, who had not laughed and who had a patch of frost at his hairline as if he'd been anointed by weather. "It is a beginning," Roose said quietly, as if to himself. "It is always a beginning." "It will end," Robb said, and he meant both things. "We will end this day, and we will end the day that comes and the day after. We will end and become stories men tell. We will be grateful to be stories." At dusk on the second day of their holding, a horn sounded in the south. Not loud, but at a pitch men's chests liked. It was an answer to a question that had been asked a long time ago. The horns on the wall cried out. Men stood on their toes like children at a fair. They looked and saw a host coming north up the King's Road. Orderly, pennons stiff in the cold, horses armored like they had been born from iron. A crowned stag on black and gold. A red heart in flame. Men shouted, "Stannis!" And some made rough signs of their mother's gods and meant it. "Stannis Baratheon." "I came as I could," Stannis said. He looked up at the wall. He looked at the ring of men who had held ground that wanted holding. He did not compliment or explain. "The boy is your brother," he said to Robb. "If he is not a boy anymore, then that is the wall's work." "He is my blood," Robb said. He did not add more because the ache of it was a private thing and the wall seemed to make privacy out of air and need. Jon came 2 days later, moving like a man who had carried messages through a place he had not wished to be famous in. He looked thinner and older and his eyes had more room behind them for unwelcome things. He climbed the wall and came to the place where Robb watched men move like small bits of a plan no one dared brag about. He stood without speaking for a long time within reach of his brother, and then he said, "Robb." And the name was a small boy's name and a man's at once. "Jon," Robb said, and did not put a hand on him first because he remembered cold men and remembered a shape like wind and did not want to make a mistake of gods. Then he reached anyway and found his brother warm and human and unbroken. Robb laughed then, the laugh bending his head forward. "Ygritte's dead," Jon said later, voice even. "She died the way stories say people die, with my arrow in her and her eyes on mine and words in her mouth. I am glad for it and I am sorry for it and I will be both until I die. I don't want to talk about it again, if I can help it." "We will not," Robb said. "We will talk instead about what we must do. We will keep you from dying today and tomorrow and the day after. When we fail, we will keep someone else." He looked at Stannis's banners and then across the white world. "We hold with him." Jon tilted his head the way he used to when listening to a tutor, then smiled a little because the days where he'd needed tutors had ended when his history lessons turned into advice asked of him by men he had imagined perfect and found only human. "We do," he said, "for a time, until the thing that is coming either stops at the wall or does not." It did not stop entirely. Nothing stops entirely. They held and bled and held, and when the snows thickened and the wind made men cry for their mothers in their sleep, the wildlings stopped trying to break at that place and flowed west and east and then, slowly, north again, looking for other ways and other choices. Stannis took Mance Rayder in a trap that had more honor than any of the men in it would ever be credited with. The king of the free folk looked upon the man who claimed all the south and the boy who held a kingdom made of stones and frost and said, "They call you kings, as if you'd been boiled in the same pot." He smiled at Jon with an expression like a man who has seen himself in a mirror. He did not expect to be honest. "You are better at lying to yourself than to others," he said, and did not explain whether he thought that a mercy or a fault. Mance died on a pyre in the old way Stannis like. D for his God's sake. And then not in the way a song would say because Jon's arrow took him in the heart before the fire did. Stannis's mouth made a shape like a slammed door. Melisandre's eyes shone once and then grew dull like old coals. The free folk watched stone-faced because they had seen worse and would see worse and could not afford the extravagance of tears. They bent the knee in droves to the wrong kings and the right gods and to the practical cold. They came south, and at Eastwatch by the sea, and at the Shadow Tower, and at Mole's Town, and at 100 smaller places they were counted and made to move where they would be least feared. Robb read in Jon's face that this mercy would rot in some men and grow bread in others. He loved his brother for giving it anyway. The North absorbed 1,000 changes in that winter, because that is what winter does. It remakes everything into something simpler and more honest. Men who had called wildling savages learned that savages use knives the way hunger does, without apology. Women who had not thought to see a giant saw one and fed him porridge with a wooden spoon for the novelty of it and then discovered the kindness of using a bigger bowl. Children learned new games out of old fear and new friends out of necessity. The gods would filled up with smoke 2 days and was empty as a head after grief the next 3. When the fight softened into fortification and the fortification into routine, Robb sent half his men home in 2s and 5s and dozens with orders to keep the roads and put up watchfires where men could see the next light on the next hill. He left men under Mormont's command and men under Stannis's when Stannis could bear it and men under no one's command but their own common sense when pride would have done more harm than help. He took a small guard and rode down the King's Road with Jon beside him until the parting came. They stopped where a standing stone squatted like an old dog by the road and looked at each other too long for comfort. "You could come," Robb said, knowing it was wicked to say it. "You could stand in my hall and make law before the heart tree and tie judgments with neat bowlines. And hear men say my father would be proud?" Jon's smile warmed and then cooled. "I have a father in a manner that does not require pride. I have a vow and a wall. If I break it and call it the better thing, I will spend the rest of my life stepping easy so the parts of me that broke don't make a noise I hear at night." Robb nodded. He took out Sansa's letter then, the one that smelled of lavender though the scent had gone off in the cold. He put it in Jon's hand. "She writes true. Even when she is sweet she writes true. She says, 'Do not be noble to your own hurt if it helps no one.'" He grinned. "I'll write her a letter full of recipes for porridges no one should eat and homely stories about men with noses bitten off by frost who never stop laughing. I'll not name a single thing that will keep her awake at night." He folded the letter and tucked it in his cloak as if paper could armor him. Robb put his hands on his brother's shoulders and leaned his forehead against Jon's. "Old as children and men both. Keep breathing," he said. "Come to me when you need to, or when you don't. Come to me if you break your vow only in your head and need someone to forgive you for it." "I'll come," Jon said. "Gray wind will smell me before the sentries do." "He will pretend he didn't," Robb said, and laughed once as a goodbye. In the Riverlands, meanwhile, a man named Sandor Clegane found that his horse had habits and that his hands, which had been instruments of terror, could hold reins in a way that did not frighten a child. He found the girl by a ford that had eaten 2 men that morning. She had a stick and a face that belonged to a boy and a way of moving like a cat that has learned to look like a stone when men look. She looked at him once and showed her teeth and made him think of a memory he had not touched in years. Being small one day and someone bigger telling him what to do with the small body. He did not like the thought. He squinted at her. "You're the wolf bitch," he said without heat. "I'm Arya Stark," she said, because she had learned that names could be given like blows when given straight. She held her stick as if it would turn into a sword if she gripped hard enough. "You are," he said, "and I'm no one's fucking knight." He looked at the ford. He looked at the girl. When he spoke, he sounded like a man arguing with a dog that had begun to live in his house uninvited. "Come on, then. You'll get your feet wet and your temper ruined if you try that ford on your own." "I don't want to go to King's Landing," Arya said at once, like a blade thrust to test the meat of a throat. "Good," the hound said. "Neither do I. Your kin keep their heads in the north these days. They went north, avoiding armed men when they could and hurting them when they had to. The hound had retained one thing from service at the court of madmen: a nose for when a road would sour. He had acquired one thing: a distaste for small amusements. He hit men who needed hitting in a workman's way, swift and without alleys of speech. Arya learned to say fewer names at night and sleep more soundly for it. She also learned that sometimes her mouth would name a man only so she could memorize how his face would look if one day she came on him in a place without witnesses. She dreamed of a she-wolf with a scar on her left shoulder who had 30 in her pack and sent trails like roads and men's blood in her mouth, and sometimes she woke with her fingernails biting her own palm, pleased. They came to a town with no name and a lot of ovens, and an old woman gave them a loaf of bread that broke under their hands like crust over a river. "Little lordling used to stop here," she said, looking at the child and the great scarred man with an expression that had been a prayer earlier in her life and was not anymore. He had red hair and teeth too straight. "He'll be taller now. The tall ones always get taller." "He will," Arya said. She put the bread into the hound's hands and then took half for herself and glared at him until he laughed through his nose. "We're going to Winterfell." "I," the hound said, as if he and the child were two old women discussing when to plant beans. "Let us both go to the place where the man with the axe lives, who cut a queen and a king into the law. Let us walk bravely toward our judgments." "We'll go through the twins," Arya said. "We'll not," the hound said with certainty. He took her west, then north and cut back east where the ground turned to old bones. The twins gleamed where the river made its narrow place, and the bridge opened its mouth like a man who means to ask for a very high price for a very small good. The hound looked and looked away. "We'll pay for that crossing with our skins," he said, and Arya, who had a sense for the inner names of men, nodded and did not argue, though a piece of her wanted to go that way just to learn what would happen if she spit. They forded higher where the water was colder and kinder. The hound lifted her once onto his horse, and she did not fight him, and he did not talk about it later. They came to Moat Cailin as men come to places that no longer remember the reasons they were built, out of respect and with the hunger for warmth that has nothing to do with fire. The crannogmen had been busy there, and the old stones wore reeds like hair. A man stepped out with a frog spear and did not look surprised to see a girl and a monster walking at his door. "Arya," he said, and she looked at him with suspicion, and then a recognition broke across her face like light. "Howland?" she asked. "Mira's father?" Her mouth quirked. "You're small." "That I am," Howland Reed said gently. "Everyone in the north is tall. It is a trick of the trees." He brought them in and fed them soup that had eels and something else in it, and watched how the hound ate and decided he had been starved earlier in life and had never quite gotten over it. He wrote a neat little letter when it had been decided that he would send a runner under reed and ice to Winterfell, and he spoke quietly to Arya about the bogs and about a boy her father had brought south once who had not come home out of a tower. He did not teach her to think the story was one story. He taught her to see that stories were like rivers and had many mouths. Arya rode into Winterfell behind a file of crannogmen in cloaks so green they seemed made of melted pine. She was no one's lady when she crossed the yard, but when she saw her mother she became a child in a way that was as fierce as any sword. Catelyn crossed the stones without grace and without shame and gathered her daughter in, and the sound she made might have been sobbing and might have been prayer. Robb came from the hall with Rickon clinging to his leg and Bran with Hodder, and looked once and then again and then crossed the yard in 5 strides. He did not run. He walked fast, with that particular control a man uses when he does not trust his body not to do something awkward in public. They stood together in a huddle that was not noble, and Grey Wind came up and woofed once, quietly, and nuzzled Arya's hand and then licked the hound's wrist as if knighthood could be given in dog gifts if men would accept it. The hound laughed, a small startled sound. He had not meant to come in with them, but it seemed he had done so. The gait made it seem purposeful. He stood beside the wolf and the boy king and cupped his great burned hand over the place the dog had slobbered. "You're a ridiculous thing," he told the wolf, not unkindly. "I know," Robb said, smiling from a place he had thought empty. "Dogs are better than men. They forgive." "I am no dog," the hound said, amused. "Ask anyone who has paid me to bite." "I will," Robb said, still smiling, and Catelyn found the breath to laugh once, and then swallow it and make herself steady. In King's Landing, the Red Woman lit bright fires and Davos Seaworth stood near them and made his face a thing that would not show fear when men watched him fail to fear. Stannis sat the Iron Throne with a grim patience that made men think of a hound with its teeth sunk into a hard bone. If the bone splintered, he would swallow it, and if it did not, he would not spit it out. He made laws law again, and men died for old sins that had not been brought to book. There were flames now in the places where there had been statues, and boys in bright red livery that made the faith gnash its renewed teeth, and men with shaved heads who stared too long. Yet there was bread. There was order. There were ships quiet in the bay with their chains up and their chains down at hours men could predict, and there was no wildfire stench on the river when the wind turned east. Tyrion Lannister did not die. He had been marked for death by his name and his wit, and escaped both by the use of the latter. He went east with Varys's arrangement and Illyrio's soft towels, and he drank too much and told himself stories about women he had loved that became less true the more he told them. He smiled often without mirth. Once he stood on a balcony in Pentos and cracked a joke about kings with dragons and men who thought that meant safety. He was surprised when a man with blue lips laughed and asked for another joke. He began to dream of a queen with a whip of hair and 3 small shadows on her shoulders who were not shadows, and he woke each time almost laughing because he had become a man who dreamed in prophecies whether he wanted to or not. The Tyrells made gardens and spies grow, as is their way. Willis wrote to Robb in a hand as precise as a surgeon's about bee. Reading hounds for weather and hawks for pest control. He sent herbs that did not survive being planted in the north but died nobly in the attempt and perfumed the soil when it was turned. Sansa wrote to Arya and did not scold her for anything that would make Arya scratch out words and run away. She wrote instead of the shape of a coin she'd seen once that had a hole in the center to make stringing easier. She wrote of Olenna saying the world would be simple if men would admit that they ate and shat and slept and everything else took care of itself. She wrote of Marjorie and her soft hands that had a surety in them that did not belong to softness at all. She wrote of the song they had sung at supper that had a verse about wolves that she had not wept at until later, when no one saw. Walder Frye sent letters to men who did not answer and letters to men who answered without promising and letters to men who promised and did not set a date. He sat by his fire and counted names and slights and children, which in his mind were largely the same thing. His sons muttered that the king had not honored him. He muttered, and the mutter turned to plans. When Tywin wrote to him asking for men and knives, Walder smiled with most of his mouth and sent men who would listen carefully to orders and then do something more profitable for themselves. He sent a letter to Roose Bolton, and Roose wrote back a letter so careful and sharp and capable of not saying a thing that a man could cut his finger on the edge. Frye smiled. He had all the time in the world. He also had none at all. But old men confuse the two so thoroughly that often the gods cannot keep them sorted out. Robb's court became a thing that men told each other of with grudging admiration and sometimes love. He sat in the great hall draped with furs and heard cases. He did not always draw his sword, and he did not always keep it sheathed. Men learned to love him for the uncertainty as much as for its opposite. He married no one and refused many, a Karstark for peace, a Manderly for bread, a daughter of a Flint for the mountain. He refused them because his heart was his own and because his head told him that winter is a bad time to change a house's roof. He asked advice of his mother and of the Blackfish and of men like Roderick and Robert and Dacey Mormont, whose advice came salted and good. Theon Greyjoy sat at his right sometimes and at the other times in the yard with boys learning to put a shaft where they meant to aim. He received a letter edged in salt saying his father was dead, walked off a bridge by the wind. He read it twice and then went outside and stood with his hands on the parapet and looked at the godswood. He did not like trees. He had said so as a boy. He stood among them and did not sicken. A kingsmoot happened on the Isle of Old Wyke, and men shouted and swore and cried out to drowned gods and broke their voices like sticks. Asha Greyjoy won men with wit and with beer and a way of walking that made men think. She knows where she is going and does not need me to get there. Victarion won men with fists and a few ugly stories told in his favor. Euron Crows I came and won men with madness and birds. He held up a thing he claimed was a dragon's horn, and men heard it and believed, and for a time believed it had broken their ribs and replaced them with something sharp. Asha saw the faces of men she had thought simple go complicated and thought, "Oh, it is that dream again, the one where I am clever and it does not matter because madness is louder," and she went back to Harlaw and sharpened her axes. Euron sent ships to the south to bite at the Reach's long flesh, and Willis Tyrell smiled and set watchers in places men did not think to look, and wrote to Sansa that the world will be thinner before it fattens again. So we must make our belts new holes. At Winterfell there was ice on the window the day Arya put on a dress without being reminded. She did it because it was clean and did not catch on splinters, not because she had repented of anything. Catelyn kissed her hair and did not say a word of thanks aloud. She had learned a long time ago that the gods look down on mothers who think their daughters have changed out of reason, and not out of the sudden need to catch a boy unprepared for warmth in the hall. Arya went into the yard after and beat 3 boys at stick fighting wearing the stupid dress, and laughed when one of them said she had bewitched him. "I have," she said. "My witchery is that I learned to hit first." She wrote to Sansa that night that the Reach puts honey on bread like a man who thinks sweetness makes the bread worth eating. "We put salt. Men keep eating our bread until they die." She drew a picture of a wolf with big feet and sent it at the bottom in case Sansa forgot wolves had feet. Bran dreamed of a man made of roots growing through his legs and out of his eyes into the sky. He told Jojen Reed, who had come with Mira and sat by the hearth with Bran's feet in his lap and a bowl of hot water near for when the boy's legs cramped. Jojen listened with the same gravity he used when told that the kitchen had run out of onions for the pottage. "You will go," he said, as if telling the weather to sit down. Catelyn said no when she was told. She said it as a mother says no to a boy who wants to go to the river alone in spring. She said it again when she was told that there were things the North demanded that did not care for a mother's no. She said it quietly a third time when she hugged Bran before dawn and Mira took him up like a parcel that could cut. And Hotter said Hotter and cried. Catelyn would hear a knock in the walls for months after, and sometimes it was a mouse. Sometimes it was a name. Robb found her once in the Godswood, and she said, "Do not speak to me," and he did not, and it was comfort. In the West, Tywin Lannister worked. He did not sleep much, and the lamps burned in his halls, and men could tell where he was by the particular way candles guttered when he walked by. He sent the mountain to do the mountain's work until the world became sick of it, and the mountain was obliged to do it elsewhere. He sent gold to the Reach and swords to the Riverlands and letters to every whorehouse that had once held a secret better than any man's wife. He bought and sold, bent and mended, broke and built. He grew thin. He read in his bed, which he had never done, and his manservant saw grief on his face exactly once, which was when he touched a ring and did not know he had done so. Stannis grew no kinder. He gave justice to men who deserved it and to men who thought they didn't and thus learned they were wrong. He went to the September of Baelor and stood before an altar to a god he did not like and ordered the candles taken down because they smoked too much and dirted the stone. The High Septon grew a beard and a backbone and prayed more loudly than was needed and made men carry him feet first through the streets as if he were already dead. There were riots and then there were not. Davos soothed burnings and Melisandre lit them. Between the two of them men did not know which god they had offended. The realm held. It held like a door held by a table leg while a man inside ties the bed to the knob with a belt. Robb sat quiet sometimes and thought of a chair made of swords and the chair that had been his father's. A plain thing with arms smooth where a hand had held 1,000 times. He chose the second chair and thought, "It is a good thing the first chair sits a man who loves the law and not the sound of men screaming by firelight." He chewed on the notion that his sister had married a man who could read in 3 tongues and plant a rose and laugh at himself, and he was grateful for it as if it were bread when the river was frozen. He missed Jon with a steady ache that did not demand to be satisfied because it knew itself a companion, not an enemy. He named an heir and it was Bran, and he did not worry this would spoil the boy, because the boy had moved already into a part of the world where the spoiling of princes had no purchase. News came at last from the east, as news does when men are tired enough of their own squabbles to be interested in someone else's. There was a woman with 3 dragons. This time it was not a tale told in wine shops. This time there were ships that had seen them fly and men who had felt the cold rush of air under their bellies when the things passed overhead, and sailors who drunk and swore that the beasts could never be taught to land and yet had watched them land, improbably upon a woman's arm. The woman had sacked cities and freed slaves and called herself a breaker of things men had sworn were unbreakable. Stannis read that letter and set it down upon a neat stack and did not say the word dragon aloud. He had fought dragons once, as a boy, with a stick and a memory of songs sung by maids who had never seen dragons, and it was enough. He did not congratulate himself on being a practical man. He counted ships. On a winter afternoon that smelled of singed hair and porridge burnt at the bottom of a pot, Robb found Theon on the wall looking south. "Smoke," Robb said, because it was, "Someone thinks himself fierce," Theon said. His hair had grown and he tied it back with a leather thong. He wore a cloak with a badger skin at the collar. He looked in that moment more of the north than he ever had, and less a part of it than he had when he was a boy of 10 and hungry for approval. Euron will take what he can take until someone makes him pay for the mischief. He has a way of taking without knowing the difference between a thing and its name. "Will you go?" Robb asked. There was no need to say where. Theon had taught him to be precise by not looking for places men hide under politeness. "Yes," Theon said, "if you ask. If you don't, I'll go because my feet itch to see the shit stains my kin are spreading on the coast." He did not smile. "I will come back. I did not always know that about myself. I like knowing it. It is like being given a cloak in a snowstorm." "Go," Robb said. "Take men who aren't fools and a few who are, because it is good for discipline to have two who must be watched. Do not kill if you can shame. Shame if you can save. When you cannot save, be clean." He grinned a little then, and a piece of boy ran across his face. "If you can shame them into doing any good for any man who doesn't scratch his beard with a harpoon, I will give you a hall of your own with a roof that doesn't leak and men to keep your horses fat." "I don't know what to do with a hall," Theon said. "Maybe I'll put the boy tied in it and teach him to spit on his feet before he comes in." "Do that," Robb said, and clapped him once on the back and felt his own life gather around him like furs at night. There were deaths and births and crops and 100 days that were only days. Men mended fences and sharpened knives. Women laughed and did work and scolded boys and cut bread. The ravens flew and sometimes fell and were eaten by things that themselves would be eaten. Once, one raven decided to live through a storm by crashing into a room through a shutter and huddling in a bread bin. Gage found him and fed him scraps, and then the bird would not leave and so learned the peculiar dignity of those who accidentally do a clever thing and take full credit for it. Robb had the bird perched sometimes near his high seat, and it hopped and shit and croaked, and men made jokes that were not funny and laughed anyway because the world was not on fire at that moment and had to be handled somehow. When spring came fully, it did so like a man who had been traveling for years and remembered suddenly he lived somewhere. The fields went green as if a hand had passed over them, and the cattle stopped looking at men like philosophers. In that season, Robb took his mother's hands and sat with her on a bench under a bit of wall that was warm and listened as she spoke of Ned. She spoke of a few days she had never told anyone because they had become special by being unsaid. She spoke of one morning when the light had come through the window and made dust into gold pieces and made Ned sneeze 6 times and made her laugh. He let the day be small in his mind and then large and then just right. "We will tell the children," he said, and she nodded. "And we will keep some of it," she said, and he nodded. He went to the godswood later and stood under the heart tree and put his hand upon its bark and said nothing. He did not make promises because he had learned that promises are a kind of coin men mint too often until they are not worth the breath they cost. He thought of fog over a river and a wolf howling, and of a queen in a hall who had smiled and lied and died, and of a boy who had eaten bread in a kitchen where he had not been wanted and had made himself want something else. He thought of his sisters, one where roses grew and one who played at swords in a stupid dress, of his brother who had a wall where law was a thing you hammered nightly with your hands and breath, of boys who were not his brothers by blood and who were, of men who had died well and poorly and the way the ground took them without comment. He thought of winter, and of the thing that was coming beyond winter too, and of dragons that had been dead and were not, and of kings men had not asked for and of kings they had. He thought of how the world is always more complicated than the song and always smaller than a god, and he laughed once to feel the pleasure of thinking these things with no witness but a tree. He put his hand on the wolf's head and felt the breath of the beast move in and out and knew the measure of it. He turned and went into his house. There would be a council. There would be bread to cut and salt to be set and letters to be answered and wolves to be fed and boys to be trained and women to be asked and listened to and rivers to be watched and far seas to be scanned and a joke to be made over supper because laughter makes the night smaller. There would be men to judge and men to forgive. There would be the story of the night the wolves took the city told again by a man who would add a bell or a bit of fog where none had been and take away a scream that had existed and no one would stop him. There would be a girl and a hawk in a garden 1,000 leagues south thinking of snow and not aching for it. There would be a man at a wall of ice touching it with his hand and saying to himself, "I have done the thing I said I would do for another night." There would be a man in a hall of light dreaming of wings. There would be old men counting as they do and boys not counting as they do. When gray wind barked once, short and content, Robb smiled because the sound meant exactly one thing. Somewhere a child had dropped a piece of bread and the wolf had picked it up and eaten it and had not seen any need to pretend it was a hunt. He went to the hall and sat the chair his father had sat and waited for men to bring him their ordinary days and their smaller griefs. He found that kingship is not sunlight on banners nor iron chairs nor even the clean fall of an axe, but the tempering of hours until the thing you make with them holds. He went on doing it because that is what men do when winter has not ended and spring has the decency to pretend it has.